Mitch Jeserich. In year 2007, Margaret Burnham set out with her research partner, Melissa Nobles, to investigate unsolved racially motivated murders during the Jim Crow era. Between 1939 and 1955, she found over 1,000 such cases which justice has never been achieved for the victim or rendered to the murderer. Margaret Burnham has written a book about it. It is called By Hands Now Known, Jim Crow's Legal Executioners. Margaret A. Burnham is the founding director of the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project at Northeastern University School of Law. She's been a staffer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a civil rights attorney, a defense attorney, and a judge. A professor of law, she was nominated by President Biden and confirmed by the Senate to serve on the Civil Rights Cold Case Records Review Board. In 2010, she headed a team in a landmark case that settled a federal lawsuit in which Mississippi law enforcement officials were accused of assisting Klansmen in the 1964 kidnapping, torture, and murder of two 19-year-olds, Henry D. and Charles Eddie Moore. She joins me over Zoom. Margaret Burnham, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this radio program.
Thanks so much, Mitch. I'm delighted to be here.
What happened in 2007 to make you embark upon this project?
In 2007, then President Bush signed the Emmett Till cold case bill. And that act was designed to encourage local prosecutors and federal prosecutors to re-examine cases that had been improperly handled during the Civil Rights era, 1954 to 1970. And there was some funding associated with the bill, and we thought we'd work with these families to help them get their cases re-examined by the federal government or by local officials. We quickly learned that there were a set of cases that were not going to be subject to prosecution because the perpetrators had died. But that nevertheless, the family members were deeply concerned about what had transpired and that no one had ever talked to them. No government official had ever come to them and said, look, we've got some records on what happened to your uncle in 1939 or 1940. Here they are. And here's what we did up in Washington. Here's what was done down in the local community. And so we turned our attention to this earlier period where there had been no examination whatsoever of these cases.
How do you do that? How do you go back and find these cases? Are there family members that are trying to keep these cases alive? I mean, you also met family members who didn't even know about this history.
Yes. So we first started with newspaper articles. So we'd gather articles from the press, mostly the Black press, the Chicago Defender, Amsterdam News. These are the newspapers that covered this, the Pittsburgh Courier. And then we would follow the trail from the newspaper article to the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the NAACP, which kept fairly robust records on some of these cases. And we develop a file, and then after we'd gotten, a way down the road, we'd go back and we'd try to find the family members, and we did this through Ancestry. Sometimes the family members would come to us, but mostly we were going to them. And we'd call them up and we'd say, look, we've got a stash of records that relate to your loved one, your grandfather, or in some cases, your father. And we'd also like to talk about your memories. And so we would sit across the table, as it were, and partner with these folks. Sometimes it was a virtual table, and partner with these family members, and then try to reverse engineer the cases to try to figure out what happened and why justice failed. And, what did the coroner do or not do? What did the prosecutor do or not do? How did these cases disappear? What happened to the families? Oftentimes the families were banished. They had to leave these areas and find refuge in California, for example, or in Detroit, Michigan, or New York City. And so many times families didn't know. Certainly the second generation down most often didn't know what happened. The generation that experienced these events, they were children at the time. So they had some memories of what transpired. They carrying that trauma with them. Sometimes they share it with their next generation down. Oftentimes they wouldn't. But most frequently, the response that we got from family members was that we're delighted to to be in partnership with you and bring this case back into the archives of American history.
The role of the black press is interesting. This is press from the north. You mentioned the Defender in Chicago, Amsterdam News in New York. Many of these cases are in the South. Was the black press covering these murders at the time?
So in the South, the press was not as robust in the South as it was obviously in communities that were, far more politically engaged, as in Baltimore, Chicago, New York, Detroit. So these were national press. Back then in the 40s and 30s and 40s and the 50s, they thought that their brief was covering African-American life. Well, obviously they'd cover local events and, obviously they got a social calendar. They'd cover all that. But their brief was really covering national African-American affairs. That certainly was the brief of the famous Baltimore Afro-Am. And so they hear about these cases, maybe from the NAACP in New York City, maybe from, some of the left organizations that were active during this period, the ILD, International Labor Defense Fund, maybe the ACLU. So they'd get, press release, and then they would publish information, which would then, by the way, Mitch, filter its way back into the South. So, in Jackson, Mississippi, for example, you had a newspaper, many of these crimes occurred in Mississippi. They wouldn't be covered by the black press in Mississippi. Now, that wasn't true across the South. The Birmingham World, the Atlanta World, these were very active, progressive-minded presses. But for the most part, you had journalists who had to protect their flank and were fairly timid. And so they didn't cover these stories in some areas of the country. And they had to depend, therefore, on the national black press. Without the national black press, Mitch, we would not have been able to do this project. That's not to say that the press always got it right. Some of the reporting is filled with errors. But it's a start. It was a starting point for us.
In your book, By Hands Now Known, you begin by talking about Ollie Hunter. Tell me about Ollie Hunter.
We came across the Ollie Hunter case, Mitch, because at a certain point, rather than starting with the press, we decided to comb the NAACP records, which are housed in the Library of Congress. Both the national records and all the branch records are now housed, and some of them are digitized, some of them are not. But we started to go through all the relevant files. They had legal files, then they had a file about police crimes, and as I say, area files. And we found a letter written by a gentleman from Donaldsonville, Georgia, small town in Georgia, in the early 1940s, 1942, I believe, who reported that a woman of senior age had gone into a shop on the main street in town and picked up a can of oil, African-American woman, and so annoyed the shop owner, who was a young white man, that he followed her out of the shop and beat her to death with an axe. And she disappears. She's invisibilized. She disappears from the records. She disappears from the world. She's dead, of course. But until we got that letter, and this doesn't appear, by the way, no newspaper articles about the case. So we get the letter, and our student matches up the dates in the letter with death certificates of African-American women from Donaldsonville, Georgia, and finds out that this woman is Ollie Hunter. She's in her 60s, 61 or 62 years old. She's childless, and that's it. That's the end of the line on that case. And so the case, as far as we can tell, from records in that the non-existence of records, was never prosecuted. The young man was never made to pay for his crime. We think we know who the shop owner is, and if he's who we think he is, a few weeks later he's sent off to the war. So, her case evinces both the vulnerability of women to this violence, as well as the ways in which the lethal violence could be disappeared, could be rendered invisible in these areas where African Americans were not voting. This is the deep, deep, deep South. The NAACP was not active. As I said, there are no Black newspapers. And so, but for that letter, the person writing the letter, without the name of the victim, whose name he apparently does not know, to New York, NAA in New York, we wouldn't know about Ollie Hunter. We'd know nothing about Ollie Hunter.
Except for one letter, in which we don't know very much about the author of.
We know his name, but nothing else. I don't know if it's a man or a woman. I don't know if it's a Black person or a white person. We have the name of the letter writer.
Were you able to?
Whom we've not been able to trace.
How about Ollie Hunter's family? Have you been able to trace her family?
Oh, boy. Oh, boy. So here, Mitch, we were able to find a family member. She's a cousin, and not a close cousin. And the sad part about this story is that she wrote us from a prison cell in Florida, where she was incarcerated for some crime, the history of which I do not know. And simply said, I'm related to Ollie Hunter, and I'd be happy to talk to you, but I can't do that now. The only way I can communicate with you is by mail. And so, in a way that links up the old Jim Crow with the new Jim Crow.
It's pretty profound.
Very profound.
When I got the press material for your book, which as a journalist, we get press material that comes along with the book to help us prepare. I read the name George Floyd, and it wasn't George Floyd from 2020 in Minnesota. It was George Floyd from Florida, 1945. And I had to look at that twice and double check it to make sure it wasn't a typo. That was my first thought. Tell me about George Floyd from 1945.
George Floyd 2, we call him, or George Floyd 1, depending on your point of view. George Floyd, in our archive, was a turpentine worker in St. Augustine, Florida. And he was not a young man. He was in his 50s by the time he died. And this is a Saturday night. He's driving around town and having a nice time with his brothers when they're stopped by a police officer, taken down to the St. Augustine jail, arrested for drunk driving. And he searched once, and then the jailers tell him he has to be searched again. And he says, "You just searched me. I don't need to be searched again." And the officer who arrested him beat him to death there in the jail cell, in front of the other jailers and police officers, and in front of the other prisoners. His case survives because, again, the NAACP, there was an NAACP in St. Augustine, Florida, got in touch with the national office. Thurgood Marshall was in contact with the local branch and made every effort to have the officer prosecuted. That never happened. We don't know today where George Floyd, 1945, is buried. We know he had no children. We know he had a wife. And we know that she died shortly thereafter, as did his brother. George Floyd's death threw a storm in the middle of that family, destroyed the family. And yet he was buried for all these years in the archive, in the records. And we were able to include him in our material. We had already included him in our archive by the time George Floyd died in 2020.
Tell me about what's going on during this period of time. You quote from a book by C. Van Woodward, The Strange Career of Jim Crow. You quote this in your own book. The Jim Crow laws put the authority of the state or city and the voice of the streetcar conductor, the railway brakeman, the bus driver, the hoodlum of the public parks and playgrounds.
What C. Van Woodward, whose strange career is one of the early authoritative books on Jim Crow, suggests that every white person was in effect a police officer. Every white person had the authority to discipline physically, if necessary, any black person who violated Jim Crow norms. This is a carryover from slavery, when in effect any white person could discipline any black person, because every black person in the slave states was assumed to be enslaved. And so here again, we have bus drivers, and I spend a good deal of time talking about the ways in which African Americans fell afoul of Jim Crow rules in buses, could be killed and were killed by bus drivers wielding guns. There's no reason for a bus driver to have a gun unless they have to use it, unless they think they have to use it. And Jim Crow put them in the position of having to, in effect, police the bus, make sure the black people stayed in the black seats and behaved in ways appropriate to their race, as it were, and make sure that the white space was secure and protected from intrusion by black folk. And they did this by, beating people up, and by shooting people. And so I've got one example in the book of a soldier, a fellow by the name of Henry Williams in Mobile, Alabama, trying to get back to his base in uniform. And he says to the bus driver, who is chatting with a neighbor, "Can you move on? I've got to make a curfew back to my base." And the bus driver is so annoyed by this request that he chases Williams, the Private Williams, off the bus, and Williams is carrying his laundry down the back steps of the bus, tumbling behind him, is shot and killed. That spurs a demonstration in Mobile. And ultimately, the Mobile African-American community is able to persuade the bus company not to desegregate the bus, although we're in the middle of a war for democracy, but to take away guns from the bus drivers. And that's city after city across the South. We have incidents like this. Another example is one in very famous case out of Durham, North Carolina, a man by the name of Booker Spicely, also in uniform, on a bus in, I believe, 1942, but certainly during the early war years. He's stationed at Camp Butner, right outside of North Carolina, also trying to get back to his base on a Saturday night. Bus driver says to him, "Get up and give up your seat for another white soldier in the same uniform." And Spicely says, "Why should I have to get up we're both in the same uniform. Why should I have to get up?" He also says, because he comes from Philadelphia, I'm not accustomed to this sort of thing. The bus driver is enraged, and Spice Lee, appreciating that the bus driver is now angry and potentially lethal, tries to apologize to the bus driver, gets off the bus. The driver follows, steps off the bus behind him, and shoots him to death on the streets of Durham. That case did result in a prosecution, state prosecution of the bus driver. However, a jury felt there wasn't enough evidence of his guilt of the murder, and acquitted him. So over and over again, you have bus drivers, librarians, and ordinary pedestrians who think that African Americans are walking too closely to them on the street. We have another case involving a man who thought, he had been dissed by a young African American man on the street, and he chases him, gets a police officer to join in the chase. Together, they end up at the jail. This is in Alabama, outside of Birmingham. Together, they end up in a jail cell, and the white pedestrian, and the police officer beat the black pedestrian to death. So this is, as Woodward said, Jim Crow is everywhere, everywhere and ever present. And in order for it to be fully enforced, you needed more than police officers with badges. You needed the white citizenry. It needed to be enforced at workplaces, on the street, in public places, in private places. And so it turns, essentially, every white person becomes a monitor and a police, and has the ability, the capacity, indeed the duty, if they are to be loyal to their race, to uphold the precepts, rules, and norms of Jim Crow.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Margaret A. Burnham. She is the author of the book, By Hands Now Known, Jim Crow's Legal Executioners. Again, Margaret Burnham, you, as I said in the introduction, between the years of 1939 and 1955, had found some 1,000 racially motivated murders that have not been, in which justice has not been achieved in those murders. That's only a 16-year period of time. That's a very short period of time to find 1,000 murders. I do want to ask about unsolved murders in general of this era. Is this a thing that is, obviously, if you have 1,000 racially motivated murders, there is a sense of it being common. But is unsolved murders a thing generally in the middle of the 20th century?
So our period is 1930 to 1950, the end of 1954, 1955, 1930, Mitch, to 1955. We picked 1930 because there is another study that takes us up to 1930. So we'd start with 1930, and we end in 1954 because that's the beginning of the formal, in the sort of traditional civil rights period, and Brown v. Board, and then the launching of the standard civil rights movement, going from 54 to 67. So we stop in 54 because there's more evidence of what's going on. You got TV, you got more newspaper coverage, that sort of thing. But there is this black hole, 1930 and 1954, and that's where we concentrate. And, we've accumulated 1,000, but there are obviously more than 1,000. I think the case we talked about a moment ago, the Ollie Hunter case, suggests that we'll never know what X is. If we have that, because we'll never know what X is, doesn't mean we can't do our best to figure out who these people are, and give them, as it were, a proper burial. And that's kind of what we're trying to do, that they deserve a name. They deserve their name. They deserve to, what happened to them deserves to be a piece of our understanding of who we are today and how we got here. And so that's why, we're in effect, unburying them. But, so we can't know what X is. It's not just a number here. It's really the nature of the violence that I think is particularly revealing and has explanatory force for those who want to figure out the path from Jim Crow to the present, from the old Jim Crow to the new Jim Crow. And so again, both the Ollie Hunter story and the George Floyd story that we've talked about here suggests sort of the quality of what suggests why it's not just about the counting, but it's also about what actually happened to these folks. So the casualness of it, the way it was, is buried, it disappears from our history. All of that, I think, is also a piece of what it is we're trying to do here, a big part of what we're trying to do here with this archive and also with the book by hands now known.
Forgive me for my error there. 1930 to 1954 is important to know. A good 24 years that you're looking at. You also get into history and speaking more of Jim Crow and issues around citizenship. I'm going to quote you here from your book. A 19th century federal case, United States versus Cruikshank, you'll correct me if I'm not saying that correctly, foreshadowed what was at stake in the 20th century struggle over federalism and citizenship. The case concerned a massacre that took place in Colfax, Louisiana on Easter Sunday, 1873. Tell me about this case, United States versus Cruikshank.
The Cruikshank case involved the slaughter of newly freed African Americans who were seeking to vote in 1873. They were voting for Republicans. They were attacked by white Democrats, and many of them were killed. A lawsuit emerged from that. This was Reconstruction. We're still in the Reconstruction era, and a lawsuit emerged from the events at Colfax, Louisiana. Cruikshank was the name of one of the men charged with the murders. The case gets up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court concludes that no constitutional right had been violated with the slaughter which occurred in Colfax in the 1870s. So, in other words, neither the 13th Amendment, which guaranteed freedom from slavery, nor the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal protection, nor the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote, nor the Second Amendment, which protected the right to bear arms. None of these constitutional protections applied to protect and secure rights to newly freed slaves. And so Cruikshank marks the abandonment of constitutional enforcement with respect to African Americans and the decline, the refusal of the Supreme Court to use the Constitution to protect African American lives from lethal anti-Black violence. So, and that's exactly what that was in Cruikshank. Those the Colfax victims are join hundreds of people who were killed in the immediate wake of slavery, attacked by the Ku Klux Klan. And the statutes that were passed then were designed to provide the federal government with the tools it needed to control this kind of violence. Cruikshank, the Supreme Court in Cruikshank says, nothing doing, we're not going to protect you.
This paves the way for Jim Crow.
Paving the way paving the way for Jim Crow.
Couldn't help but also notice this is right around the same time period as the election that we've heard a lot about, and after the last election, the election of 1876, very controversial election in which Rutherford B. Hayes beats Samuel Tilden. A lot of controversy over who actually won that and negotiated. They negotiated amongst each other, and basically the Democrats let the Republicans, Rutherford B. Hayes, become president in return for Republicans ending the military occupation of the South, hence ending Reconstruction. Do you see a relationship to that?
I do, because, yes, that's the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1876, which marks the formal end of Reconstruction. Cruikshank signals, the Supreme Court's decision in Cruikshank signals to politicians in Washington, we've had enough of this. Okay, slavery's over. The Civil War is over. We need fully to reintegrate, the white the former Confederacy states into the Union. The only way we're going to do that is by allowing white Southerners to continue to rule over Black Southerners, and to continue to extract their labor by whatever means is necessary, and to continue to disenfranchise them. That's the hidden or not so hidden message, the quiet part basically of Cruikshank, and it paves the way, opens the door for the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, which does in effect withdraw federal forces from the South and allow the former slave states, the slaveocracies, to return to their earlier days. No chains, everything else is still present.
What I also learned from your book, By Hands Not Known, Jim Crow's Legal Executioners, is that you had a form of, in the previous century, we have the Fugitive Slave Act, in which if a person who was enslaved got to a free state, would be forced back to the state in which they were enslaved in. There was a form of this for people who were, obviously didn't have slavery in the 20th century, but there was a form of this in which people who were migrating out of the South to the North were being forced back into the South. Is that correct?
So, no, so here's what I write about in the book, Mitch. I talk about cases where folks in the South who are running away from lethal violence, including potential lynchings, end up in the North, in places like Detroit. I focus on Detroit as a sanctuary city. And obviously sanctuary cities rings as a familiar ring to those of us who today. Back then, it applied to individuals who were fleeing, and their families, because the families had to leave too, who were fleeing, but the Southern states wanted to get them back. They wanted to bring them back and subject them to sham criminal trials, or sham criminal trials if they could get them into a courtroom before the lynch mob got them. And these are cases where relationships develop between legal communities in the North and communities in the South, so that the escapees, following in the footsteps of former slave escapees to these northern sanctuary areas, would be protected. And I tell the story of one gentleman and his wife who escaped from a small town in Mississippi in 1937, gets up to Detroit. When he gets up to Detroit, Mississippi wants him back. And Detroit governor at that point was Governor Murphy. At that point was Governor Murphy. Frank Murphy ultimately becomes a Supreme Court justice, and says, no, we're not returning him to what would in effect be a lynch mob in Mississippi. And so it defines the relationship between, again, going back to Reconstruction and the Civil War, it, suggests that there is still this arm wrestling relationship between the southern states and the northern states, and also suggests that northern African American communities and their allies in the North are voting, are politically active, and are thereby able to protect the folks who are escaping Southern violence.
How long does the Cruikshank decision remain the law of the land?
That's a good question. Cruikshank was never directly overturned, was never directly reversed, but later courts do begin to enforce the statutes, the Reconstruction era statutes around Jim Crow. Later courts do begin to enforce the Reconstruction era statutes that were designed to protect Black life.
So they end up, you're talking 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment to the Constitution.
I'm talking about the amendments, but also not just the constitutional amendments, but as well, Mitch, the statutes that were adopted under those amendments. So what the amendments do is they instruct Congress pass laws to protect equal protection, to protect people from being re-enslaved, and to protect the right to vote. So, for example, the Voting Rights Act, which is now being considered by our Supreme Court, was passed pursuant to the directive of the 14th and 15th Amendments to protect voting rights.
Okay, so there are other steps to, once again, provide for the protection of 13th, 14th, 15th, and the statutes that would come from them, protections
right.
for
Mitch.
people. But,
exactly.
But interesting that Cruikshank has never been overturned in of itself. I think this is a case that maybe most people have never heard of outside the legal profession.
I think it's a case that should get more attention. Eric Foner, who is the scholar of Reconstruction, our most prominent Reconstruction history, along with historian, along with W.E.B. Du Bois, talks about Cruikshank being one of the bloodiest battlefields of the Reconstruction period.
Yeah. You have provided these records for public consumption.
Yes, we have. Mitch. We have created an archive, which is available to the public, crrjarchive.org. That's one word, crrjarchive.org, where one will find all of the cases that we have researched, those 1,000 cases that you and I have talked about, and all of the documents that we've collected. We expect that individuals will find their relatives there, individuals with whom we've perhaps not been in touch. And we know this is true because the archive's been out for a couple of weeks, and we've heard from people who tell us that they found their loved ones in the archive. So the cases tell the story, for example, of police violence in Birmingham, Alabama in the 1940s, when the police went on a shooting rampage, a murder rampage, essentially, and killed African Americans, really at whim, basically. And so all of those cases, there are about 100 of them, are all included in the archive as well. And, as I say, we'll never know what X is. In part, in Birmingham, the police kept records. In many of these cities, there were no records were kept. So we may never know what the count is in some city in North Carolina, for example, or Virginia, for example, because those records were either never kept or were destroyed.
So you put these records out there in part to try to find out more information and to have the public look through it to see what else could still be found as part of the actual research process in of itself.
In effect, we're crowdsourcing. So we're, again, partnering with the public to get more information about the cases that are included, to learn about cases that should be but aren't included in our time and geographical framework. And ultimately, we'll expand the archive to include other states.
I know I'm going to be getting emails about that website, CRRJ Archives.
CRRJ Archive, one word, .org. CRRJarchive.org. And I urge folks to visit. Not only will this be useful for families and communities, but as importantly, it'll be really useful for scholars who historians, political scientists, legal scholars who know something about the period, have obviously read The Strange Career of Jim Crow, and the other material that's out there. But I think we've added an enormously important chapter to our history of Jim Crow. And also we've added an enormously vital chapter to our understanding of anti-Black violence in the 20th century and over time. First of all, on the Jim Crow thing, I think we show the archive establishes how critical violence actually was. And here we're just talking about lethal violence. We're not really talking about, other forms of physical violence, rapes, and that sort of thing. Nor are we talking about, material deprivation, which in effect is a form of violence. But we've added this material to because I think it will encourage scholars to use this lens to think about, rethink our understandings of the Jim Crow period. And secondly, with respect to violence generally and African-American life and culture, this really gets us away from the lynching trope, which is kind of what people think about when they think about pre-1950 violence. Everybody's thinking, okay, we got the tree, we got the body, we got the charred, ground beneath the tree, that sort of thing. We got the terror, we got the mob standing around. And yes, that's been memorialized and obviously is a uniquely American phenomenon. But what we say here is that equally significant are the crimes that took the lives of people like going back to our earlier conversation, George Floyd, who dies in a jail cell in St. Augustine, Florida, in 1945. That case would reflect what one commentator at the time said is what's going on here. Lynching goes underground. It leaves the forest and it travels into the police vans and the police stations. And that's where the killing fields now are. And so, showing that progression from spectacular lynchings to police violence is something that I think will be really well illustrated by the documents that are in the archive.
In all the cases you followed, did you find any cases in which the perpetrators of the violence were still alive?
We found a few. One case in particular, at Mobile, Alabama, our student was able to call the perpetrator on the phone and established that indeed he was still alive. This is a man who was killed in 1948, again at a bus stop in Alabama. The victim was talking to a fellow, co-worker, white co-worker, asked the guy for a beer, if he wanted to have a beer together. Guy says, "I don't drink with N's." And our victim says to him, "Well, President Truman is going to fix all that. He's going to fix our civil rights laws." Next thing you know, the two of them get off the bus at the same stop, and the white guy kills the black guy with some sort of tool that he had with him, beats him to death right there on the street. And we found the white guy. He's old now, and he lives in Florida, or he lived in Florida. And we did call him on we did have a phone conversation with him, but that's where that ended.
He didn't want to talk.
No, he didn't. Surprise, surprise.
Is there any legal recourse since he's still alive?
We explored this with the family of the victim, and at the end of the day, decided there were other things we wanted to do. A street was named after the victim in Mobile. There were other restorative events and practices that were more important to that family.
It's not something the state would have an interest in pursuing? I mean, there's not a statute of limitations for murder, or is there? I'm not the law professor,
yeah,
though. Yeah.
Yeah, the question is how you prove it. That many years, you can't put the perpetrator or the alleged perpetrator on the stand and say, "Did you do it?" You got to find some proof. And once you wait 60 years to prosecute a case, those leads dry up, those witnesses dry up, that forensic evidence becomes unavailable.
Yeah, that makes sense. Did you reach out to, even for those who did perpetuate the violence who are now dead? Did you talk to any of their families?
We did talk to family members, and there's an organization out here that works with family members who are interested in coming to terms in their families. The name escapes me at the moment. I'm sorry. But there are a number of people who are, working on the family side, on the perpetrator side of this. Karen Brannon is a writer whose relative was a sheriff in one of the counties involved in some of these killings in Georgia, and she has written a book about it. So there is a very active and robust community of former perpetrators and their families who are trying to make sense of this.
Margaret A. Burnham has been our guest. Again, she is the author of the book that we've been in conversation about called By Hands Now Known, Jim Crow's Legal Executioners. And again, that website, if you want to look through these records, is crrjarchives.org. Margaret Burnham, very important work. Thank you for taking this time to talk about it with us today.
Mitch, thank you so much for having me. It's been a delight to be here at KPFA.